So my name is Sharon Dodua Otoo. I'm a novelist from Berlin.
So we're sitting here in Sydney on a beautiful summer morning. Sun's shining outside. Big question, have you been to Australia before?
I have been to Australia before, but it was a long time ago. I came around 2001 when I was still on a PhD program. And back then I was doing research on telecommunication unions and comparing Australia and the UK. So I was in Sydney and Melbourne.
So you were obviously preparing for a great career in business.
Yes.
And now you're a successful writer writing in German language. So how did your life
translate?
Yes.
Well, so the telecommunications union PhD was not my first love. I kind of was maneuvered into that by circumstance. And at some point, I decided to leave the university and I moved to Germany and started working there in civil rights organizations. And while I was working, I was also pursuing my hobby of creative writing. And then at some point, the creative writing took over.
And this very point is such a beautiful story. You have to share it with us.
Well, okay, so what I can say was, again, because of my work with civil rights, I was approached to write an essay about privilege. And I decided that this kind of article had already been written many times, and the conversation was kind of always within the same group. It was like preaching to the choir, right? Preaching to the converted.
Yes.
Something like that.
Something like that.
And so I thought, why don't I try perhaps to reach other target audiences by using literature? So I wrote a short story, a satire, and this story was supposed to illustrate how people have different perspectives on things. And in order for us as a society to be able to move forward, we need all perspectives, right? That was the idea. And this story wasn't published in the publication that I was originally asked to participate in because the editor didn't receive the funding. So literally the story was lying around in the bottom of a drawer. And then in 2016, in February, I was contacted by a journalist called Sandra Kegel from the FATS, and she was a jury member on the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize jury, and she said, there's this competition, we're looking for writers who can write a short story. Would you be interested in participating? And yeah, luckily I didn't know that this prize was live on television. And but I agreed, and Sandra and I worked together that year with my participation in this competition, and I ended up winning with this very, very bizarre satirical short story. Then I got an agent, then I got a book contract, and now here it is, and here I am.
Here it is, and here you are. And this book has been written in English, in German?
The book was written in German, yes. Why did I write it in German? I asked myself that a lot while I was writing. But the reason I wrote it in German was quite simple. First of all, the short story I wrote was in German. And that was deliberate. There's a lot of information about privilege and critical whiteness in English. It's a very English language discourse. And I felt that it would be good to have some German language texts. My target audience was people living in Germany. That's where I live. That's where my Lebensmittelpunkt is. That's where my children are growing up. So I very much consider myself to be part of the German society. Even before I had German nationality, I would have said I'm German because I live here. And so it was important to me to write the short story in German. And then, of course, when I won the prize, this was a prize for German language fiction. It felt to me very important to write the novel that was coming from the short story, that was inspired by the short story, to write that also in German. There would have been the possibility for me to write the novel in English and then to have it translated. But I understand language and creativity and the development of plots and characters and things very, very tightly linked to the language that I'm writing in. And if I'd written it in English, it would have taken a completely different turn. And then it would have been slightly removed. You know, the idea that I live in Germany and I'm part of German society would have been broken somehow if I'd written it in English and then it had been translated. So I decided that I'm going to take 5 years, but I'm going to keep going until the novel is finished in German.
Well, as a Goethe-Institut, we are teaching German, we're
Yes.
supporting the teaching of German language, and worldwide it has a reputation of being difficult. Is it difficult?
I mean, I think the accusation of languages being difficult has a lot to do with a fear of making mistakes when you're speaking the language. I think, and writing, of course, the language. And this is a shame because I think many people around the world in any way multilingual societies where, children grow up speaking 3, 4, 5 languages, there isn't a concept, I believe, of a language being difficult. It's just a language you speak or you don't speak, well or not well. So I can understand why people consider German to be difficult. If you're an English language speaker, it's very awkward to think about the word the having 3 possible nouns having genders and having to choose the right one. And then in the cases, nominative, accusative, dative, genitive, that's all very, very overwhelming at the beginning. But I actually found German really a pleasure to learn. I remember in school, I found it a very logical language, actually, and I was very good at maths when I was in school as well, and German felt very mathematical to me. There were rules, and if you have this word in this part of the sentence, and this is the right answer, So the difficulty literally is only in speaking as if you were someone who'd learned this from infancy, which I do not. I will never speak German like that, but I think I don't need to. I think the beauty of learning languages is that people then speak it with an accent, and actually that shows that they've made an effort and they really want to be in community and in communication. So that's my answer.
The writing process in German language, is that like the kiss of the muse? You write it down 10 pages on a sunny morning like today, or is it an earnest 9-to-5 job like all of us sitting down at the desk, precise times? How do you create your work?
It's actually a bit of both, depending on sometimes. So right at the beginning of a novel, the second time I'm writing a novel, so I can say right at the beginning when I write a novel, it is more of this inspiration idea. What do I want to write about? What's moving me at the moment? And then I start to write out of this kind of exploration idea. And sometimes, 10 pages is not something that I usually write. I'd maybe write 10 sentences. But it is that kind of waiting to see what comes up and what are the associations. And then there is a phase where it's very difficult to write, where there's no creative juices flowing, where I'm just like, I regret this. Let me go and work in a supermarket. Right? And then it becomes a job. Then it's like, no, keep here, keep at it, keep going. And that also has something to do with deadlines as well. The closer you get to a deadline, the more mechanical, the more pragmatic you have to get. So there's a lot of both in there. Mm-hmm.
And you're not only a successful writer, successful political activist, you're also a very loving mother of 4. How do you organize that? Like Thomas Mann,
I have a wall in my
garden.
garden.
In the garden, protecting you from the children?
No, I've played around with different strategies. I'm not going to say I've always managed it souverain, whatever that word is in English. I think I have struggled to manage everything. I wouldn't want to give the impression that it's easy to do. But at the end, I decided that the children are the priority, actually, and everything else follows from there. Why do I write? I write because it's important for me to engage with the world in a creative way, engage with society and debates in a creative way, with the ultimate aim that I put my mark. I leave the world better than I arrived in it. And that has to do something with me having children and wanting them to live in a better world, for example. So I try to think about all of these things. I think the job as a writer, as a creative writer, also means that I can spend a lot of time at home. I can be flexible to a great extent about my working hours, and that helped very much sometimes in times when my children really needed me. They had an emotional problem or were not feeling well or something. And if I do that, if I put my children first, it becomes very much easier to organize everything else. If I try to have like competing priorities, that's a disaster. But if I say, okay, very clearly the children come first, once they're good, it's a little bit like the aeroplane model of the mask, right? If they're good, then I can contend to that. And that works generally quite well. They also understand if I'm under pressure, if I have a Zoom meeting and it's very important because it's an interview or something like that, they will give me the time. They're older by now as well. They're growing older. When my youngest was a toddler, that was, I had to be a little bit more flexible. Yeah, but by and large, it works. Yeah.
Leaving a better world behind. That's a nice one. We live in politically quite excited times.
Yeah.
Does literature have to be political these days?
That's a question that I find difficult to give one simple answer to. One answer is, I think all creatives, including people who write novels, should be free to write about whatever they want. And if they decide during this time that it's their calling to write a novel about flowers, how beautiful they are, that's absolutely legitimate, I feel. It doesn't make sense to force people into clear political statements. On the other hand, I feel like as a black writer living in a predominantly white society, I'm anyway politicized. It can often happen that my person is seen to represent many, many more people than I actually do. People I will never meet, but all of a sudden I'm seen as like a representative of their experiences, their points of view. So with that comes some kind of responsibility. I'm aware of that. And then I also think that if we are living in a time where there are great injustices happening, abuse of power and discrimination, that it actually isn't possible to be neutral. That's my conviction. It's like something is going wrong. If I witness an atrocity happening, I can either try to stop the atrocity. Of course, I can try maybe to participate in it, but the idea that I can just be a neutral bystander doesn't really ring true for me. And I think people who choose to remain neutral in times where there are great atrocities taking place are actually siding with the people with the most power in that situation. So that's why it's a confusing answer. I find art very, very political, actually. Even the people who claim that they are not political, I find that a political statement too. It's a choice to not engage in these things.
As a writer, you're particularly asked to continuously explaining the world, the defaults of the world, the troubles of the world. There seems to be a strange logic that it's not the filmmakers and not the visual artists. It's always the authors on the stage explain everything to us.
Yeah.
Do you find that difficult, or do you enjoy that? Do you have an explanation? Why is that?
Yeah, no, I don't have an explanation. But I think for me personally, it kind of fits because I also market myself as an activist. So I don't have a problem with it. I don't claim to know everything, and I don't think I always say the right thing, but I think it's okay to ask me because I say, this is what I'm doing with my literature. I'm trying to engage with the world. But I think there are a lot of creative writers, as I've said, who literally just would prefer to sit in their room or at the beach, wherever they do it, and write something, create something beautiful, and release that into the world, and then say, that's for you now. I've done my part. And I don't know exactly why we as a society would then try to drag these writers onto stage and say, comment on this thing that's happening. I don't know. That's maybe because it's such a privilege to have the space to go away and think for an extended amount of time on your own. Maybe that's something that people see as a gift that can be shared with others. So now you've thought about things. Let's know what you were thinking about. Maybe that's the reason.
Very difficult to ask a question now.
Yeah.
The book lying in front of you,
Yeah.
your first novel, Ada's Raum, Ada's Realm, Ada's Room, is a very, very complex story.
Yes.
With Ada in 4 emanations over 500 years. If you were to give the elevator pitch, what's the message of the book?
Yes, the elevator pitch.
The elevator pitch. This is not a New York skyscraper with 100 floors.
It's only 4?
12, let's say.
12, okay. I would say, I call it a book that explores how history, and especially traumatic events in the past, still have an effect on us in the present day, and how we deal with this, both at an individual level and a societal level, has an effect. Like, how do we deal with this? If we try to repress it, then it will resurface. And so it's an exploration of what happens when we finally decide, okay, we are going to confront ourselves with these traumatic events in the past. And my novel looks at a fictional character called Ada or Ada or Ada, depending on which geographical region she's living in, and follows her journey experiencing traumatic events in the past in different geographical areas, as I've said, finally reaching the year 2019 in Germany. And in the year 2019 in Germany, she's a young woman looking for a place to live, looking for a space, looking for a safe space for her and her child, and is finally coming to terms with traumatic events in the past.
This search for a place to live takes place in Berlin, and you live in Berlin as well.
I do.
You moved there from London.
Yeah.
So what's the biggest difference between London and Berlin?
Well, actually, literally, I moved there from Brighton. I did
nice
grow up.
Little step in
Yeah,
between.
it was a step in between. I was born and raised in London. I spent my formative years there. Then I studied at a university near Windsor, Royal Holloway University of London. And then I bounced between Brighton and Berlin for a little while before I finally settled in Berlin in 2006. But I do remember comparing London and Berlin a lot when I first moved, because London is so much bigger. So I would be in Berlin and I felt like a big fish in a little pond, I used to say. In London, I was a little fish in a big pond. And in Berlin, I was a big fish in a little pond. And people used to think that was a strange thing for me to say, that Berlin is so small, right? Because Berlin is very big for German city. But it has this feel of being manageable for me. I had the feeling I was getting to know Berlin very well. I was meeting a lot of people who lived in Berlin. At the time when I first moved to Berlin, it was a lot cheaper than London. It was more child-friendly, I felt. I felt that it was also a society, or as a city, where I could easily live bilingually. I speak German and I have English as my first language, and it was important to me that my children were raised speaking English and German. That wouldn't have worked in London. I just would have crashed and burned. I tried. I tried, but it wasn't possible, because I can't credibly speak German to my children. And anyway, there wasn't enough of an environment in England to support this German-speaking culture. So when I moved to Berlin, all of a sudden it was so much easier. I could stick to just speaking English, and the children was picking up German in school, of course, and in their kindergarten. But they also were able to go to a state school in Berlin, which was bilingual. So they were being taught in English and German. And this was really, really important, I think, for them, for their formative years, for their identities as British German children.
That's great. I think one speciality of Berlin is its very distinct Kiez culture.
Yeah.
The Kiez being the neighborhood, every neighborhood being very, very peculiar.
Yeah.
So what's your Kiez and how is it?
My Kiez is actually Kreuzberg. This is where I moved in 2006, and there's 2 Kreuzbergs. There's 61 and 36. And I lived in 61, which just means it's an area of Kreuzberg which is around the street Bergmannstraße. I loved this place. I lived there, I think, 10 years. And I ended up moving to a different Keats called Mitte, which I also really like. But my heart is still in Kreuzberg. Yeah.
That sounds like a title for a new novel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Australians love Berlin a lot.
Yeah.
Plenty of my favorite coffee places were run by Aussies, places like Antipodes or Bondi. What's your secret advice for Australians coming for a holiday in Berlin? A place they should absolutely see that's maybe not in their Lonely Planet guidebook?
Berlin changes a lot as well. There's often like pop-up cafes, pop-up restaurants, things coming and going. So it could be that I recommend something that doesn't exist by the time this video is published. But there's a place that I really like. I'm not sure if it would be in the Lonely Planet Guide or not. And it's called Yam, with Y-A-A-M. Yam is near Ostbahnhof, and it's an outdoor area which is like a hangout. Very, very, the culture is like Jamaican, the reggae music, live music often, people playing basketball, people having barbecues, selling jerk chicken, and it's a very free atmosphere, and you go there with your family and you just hang out the whole day, and there are cultural events. And I really enjoyed Yam a lot back in the day, so I am assuming it's still there, and it was, by the time that this goes online. And then I recommend that. It's a great place to also meet people and be introduced to a Berlin that doesn't seem to be German on the face of it, because the face of Germany usually looks quite different. Yeah.
You mastered a very difficult question. Now you're ready for the most difficult of all.
Oh.
I give you the first half of a sentence and you just complete it.
Okay.
Auf Deutsch even. Berlin ist...
Ja, tatsächlich. Berlin ist die Stadt, wo ich mein Black Coming Out hatte. That's it. Berlin ist die Stadt, wo ich gelernt habe, was es bedeutet, eine politische schwarze Person zu sein. Da habe ich sehr viele, sehr wichtige Personen kennengelernt. So it was an extremely important city for me in my growing up. In terms of how I became who I am today, Berlin was a key city for me. I came to Berlin in 1995 for the first time, and I still have friendships from that time, and I just learned incredible much about myself and who I am and who I want to be.
We started this little conversation in Australia, and we're back in Australia. You have a few days left. So what are you going to do, and what did you enjoy most here in Sydney?
What did I enjoy here most? Wow. I think the food and all the different places that I ate. I always had really delicious food. I enjoyed the coffee, of course, and the beaches. The most spectacular thing was the helicopter ride, I think. Over the Sydney Harbour. I went on a 20-minute helicopter ride. It was a birthday gift. And that was quite amazing. And it was a new thing. I've never done something like that before. So maybe that's the thing that I enjoyed the most.
Or you're off to...
And now I'm off to... Hopefully I'm going to be seeing... Manly. That's it. Hopefully I'm going to be seeing Manly today. And I would also like to see Watson's Bay, if I can fit that in. And a close friend of mine has really encouraged me that I must go and visit the koalas. I should go and say hello to koalas. So, yeah, those are the three things that somehow on my list.
Thank you so much for making the 16,000 kilometers from Berlin. It's lovely having you. Lovely having you.
I had a wonderful time, really. Yeah, it was very special.